Hello, night seekers, and welcome to Midnight Scary Storyteller, a place where forgotten tales and gentle voices guide you softly into sleep, wrapped in mystery and shadow. Before tonight's story begins, don't forget to subscribe and tell me, where in the world are you listening from tonight? Leave a comment below. I always love seeing where these midnight stories find their way. Now dim the lights, get comfortable, close your eyes, and let's drift together into the unknown. When I was 10 years old, I lived just outside a small town in New Brunswick, Canada. Our house was surrounded by woods. It was not completely isolated, but it felt that way sometimes, especially to a kid. There were trees behind the house, trees along the sides of the property, and enough forest around us that you could walk for a while without seeing another building if you went in the wrong direction. I loved it. At that age, being surrounded by woods felt like having the biggest playground in the world. I spent as much time outside as I could. I climbed over fallen trees, built little forts out of branches, followed trails that probably were not real trails, and wandered through the trees pretending I was exploring some place nobody else had ever seen. Most kids around me did the same thing. We were always outside. We would ride bikes, play in the yards, chase each other through the trees, and stay out until someone's parents called them in for dinner. The town was small enough that people knew one another. Everyone knew which families lived on which road. People knew each other's dogs, cats, trucks, and habits. Because we lived outside town, we got to know a lot of the local pets too. You would see the same dogs running around certain properties. You would know which one belonged to the family down the road, which one barked at every passing car, and which one liked to follow kids around when they were outside. There were dogs I recognized, even if I did not know their names. That is why the dog I saw that day has always stayed in my mind. I had never seen it before. Not once. It was not one of the neighborhood dogs. It did not belong to anyone I knew. At least, not that I was ever able to find out. It started like any other day. I had gone outside to play. I do not remember whether I was alone from the beginning or whether I had been with someone earlier, but I remember being comfortable in the woods. I had been there plenty of times. I knew the trees behind our house. I knew the general direction of the road. I knew that if I kept the house behind me and the open space in front of me, I should be able to find my way back. That was what I thought. Anyway, when you are 10, you do not always understand how easy it is to get turned around in the woods. Everything can look familiar. Every tree can seem like a tree you have passed before. Every path can look like it leads somewhere you recognize. You notice a fallen log, a patch of moss, a group of rocks, and you convince yourself you have seen them already. Then you turn around, and nothing looks the same. At first, I did not realize I was lost. I had probably wandered farther than usual, following something interesting. Maybe I was chasing a sound. Maybe I had found a path through the trees and decided to see where it went. Maybe I had been pretending I was on an adventure and kept walking until the familiar parts of the forest were behind me. I remember stopping and looking around. I expected to see something I knew. A fence, a clearing, a road, the edge of somebody's yard, the smoke from a chimney. Anything, but all I saw were trees, tall trees, bushes, uneven ground, patches of sunlight breaking through branches. There was no house in sight, no trail I recognized, no voices, no sound of cars. Nothing that told me which direction home was. At first, I did what a kid does when they are trying not to panic. I picked a direction and started walking. I thought I would eventually find something familiar. I told myself I only had to keep moving. Maybe I would come out near the road. Maybe I would see a house. Maybe I would hear someone outside. Maybe I would find my own footprints or recognize a tree I had passed earlier. But the more I walked, the less familiar everything became. The woods seemed to keep changing around me. There were places where the ground dipped low, places where fallen branches blocked the way, and sections where the trees stood so close together that I had to push through brush to get past them. I would walk for a while, stop, and turn in a circle, hoping something would click in my mind. Nothing did. Every direction looked wrong. I remember feeling the first real wave of fear when I realized I could not even tell where the sun was supposed to be helping me. I knew the general idea that the sun could tell you direction, but I was 10 years old and scared. The light kept shifting through the branches. I had no watch. I had no map. I had no phone. I did not even know how far I had gone. I just knew that I had been walking for a long time and had not found home. I started calling out. At first, I did not scream. I just called for my mom or dad, hoping they might hear me. But the woods swallowed my voice. My words traveled a little way and then disappeared into the trees. Nobody answered. I kept walking. At some point, I started to feel like I had been out there for hours. Time in the woods does not feel normal when you are lost. 10 minutes can feel like an hour. An hour can feel like an entire day. I remember getting tired. My legs hurt. I was thirsty. I was worried that it might get dark, even though I do not think it was anywhere close to evening yet. I kept trying to stay calm. I told myself my parents would find me. I told myself I would find the house soon. I told myself that I just needed to keep looking. But eventually, I reached a point where I did not know what else to do. I had probably been wandering for around 2 hours, though it felt longer. I was exhausted, confused, and scared. I could not see any sign of a road or a house. I did not know whether I was getting closer to home or farther away. So I sat down at the base of a tree. I remember the tree being wide enough that I could lean against it. The ground beneath it was dry compared to some of the other places I had walked through. There were leaves and needles around the roots, and I remember hugging my knees for a while and trying not to cry. I was not completely giving up, but I had stopped moving. I did not know what direction to choose anymore. The forest around me was quiet. Not silent, exactly. There were natural sounds. Wind moving in the trees. A bird somewhere in the distance. Maybe insects buzzing. Maybe the small sound of leaves shifting in the breeze. But compared to how loud everything had felt while I was walking, it suddenly seemed too quiet. Then I heard something move in the bushes nearby. At first, I froze. The rustling was not far away. It came from somewhere to my side, close enough that I could hear branches and leaves being pushed apart. I did not know what it was. My imagination immediately jumped to the worst things. I thought it could be a wolf. I thought it could be a lynx. I knew there were animals in the woods, and even though I probably did not fully understand what I was likely to encounter, I was 10 years old and alone. Any sound coming from thick bushes felt dangerous. I sat completely still. The rustling got closer. Then something came out of the brush. It was a dog. A large dog. I remember being startled because for 1 second, before I could see it clearly, I really did think it might be some kind of wild animal. It was big enough that it did not immediately feel safe. It had the shape of a large shepherd-type dog, and the best guess I can make now is that it was probably a German shepherd. But my memory is old. It happened more than 10 years ago, and I cannot swear that was the exact breed. I only remember that it was large, alert-looking, and much bigger than the small neighborhood dogs I was used to seeing. It stepped out from the bushes and looked at me. For a moment, neither of us moved. I remember staring at it, trying to decide whether I should run or stay still. The dog did not growl. It did not bare its teeth. It did not move toward me in an aggressive way. It just looked at me. Then it walked closer. I was still scared. Even though it was clearly a dog, I was lost in the woods and alone. I had no idea whether it belonged to someone. I did not know whether it was friendly. I did not know whether it had followed me or whether it had just happened to be nearby. The dog came right up to me. Then it nudged my arm. Not hard, just enough to get my attention. It pushed its nose against me the way a friendly dog does when it wants to be petted. Something about that completely changed how I felt. I was still nervous, but the fear began to loosen. I reached out slowly and touched its head. The dog let me. Its fur felt real and warm under my hand. I petted it carefully at first. Then I started petting it more normally, the way I would pet any dog I knew. The dog stayed close. It did not pull away. It did not seem frightened of me. And for the first time since I realized I was lost, I did not feel completely alone. That was the biggest thing. I had spent what felt like hours surrounded by trees, unable to find anyone, unable to hear anyone, and unable to recognize anything around me. Then, this dog appeared out of nowhere, sat or stood near me, and let me touch it. It gave me something familiar. A dog was not a person, but it was alive. It was calm. It was close. It made the woods feel less empty. I remember talking to it. I do not remember what I said exactly. I may have asked it where it came from. I may have told it I was lost. I may have called it a good dog. At 10 years old, I probably said anything that came into my head. The dog looked at me for a while. Then it turned and started walking away. At first, I thought it was leaving, but after taking a few steps, it looked back at me. It did not run. It did not disappear into the brush. It simply walked forward a little, stopped, and looked over its shoulder. I remember thinking that it wanted me to follow. Again, I cannot say whether that is what was really happening or whether I was just desperate for any direction. But at that moment, it felt obvious. The dog started walking. Then it looked back. I got up from the base of the tree. I had nothing to lose. I was lost, tired, and had no better plan. Following a large dog I had never seen before might not have been the safest thing in the world, but I was 10 years old and scared. It felt like the only thing in the woods that seemed to know where it was going. So I followed it. The dog moved through the trees at a steady pace, not too fast. It was not running away from me. It walked far enough ahead that I could see it, then stopped or slowed down enough that I could catch up. Every now and then, it looked back. I stayed close. At first, I was worried it would lead me deeper into the forest. I kept expecting the woods to become even stranger. But after a while, I started noticing small things that seemed more familiar. The ground became less uneven. The trees began to thin out in places. There were faint signs of a path, or at least an area where people might have walked before. I still did not recognize exactly where I was, but I felt less lost than I had before. The dog kept going. I followed for what felt like another half hour. By then, I was tired, but hopeful. I remember focusing on the dog's back as it moved ahead of me. I did not want it to disappear. I kept thinking that if I lost sight of it, I would be lost all over again. Then I saw something through the trees. At first, I thought it was just a patch of light. Then I realized it was my house. I could see part of it through the branches. I remember stopping for a second, because I could not believe it. After all that walking, all that panic, and all that time spent trying to figure out where I was, there it was. Home, it did not even feel real at first. I could see the familiar shape of the house, but the woods around me still did not look familiar. I did not recognize the direction I had come from. I did not recognize the trees or the ground near that side of the property. It was as if the dog had brought me back from a part of the forest I had never known existed. I started moving faster. As I got closer, I heard voices. My parents were calling for me. I could hear them shouting my name from somewhere near the house. Their voices sounded worried. I do not know how long they had been looking for me, but hearing them made the fear I had been holding in finally break loose. I ran toward them. I remember the relief of seeing them clearly. I remember running up to them, probably crying or close to it, and feeling safe again the second I reached them. After being alone in the woods, surrounded by unfamiliar trees, being able to see my parents felt unreal. They asked where I had been. I told them I had been lost. They asked how long I had been gone. And then they said something that confused me. They said I had only been gone for around half an hour. Half an hour. That did not make sense to me at all. I felt like I had been lost for at least 2 or 3 hours. I remembered walking for what felt like forever. I remembered sitting under the tree. I remembered feeling tired and giving up. I remembered following the dog for a long time before I saw the house. But my parents were sure it had only been around 30 minutes. At the time, I did not know what to make of that. Maybe they were wrong. Maybe they had not noticed exactly when I left. Maybe I had lost track of time because I was scared. That is probably the most likely explanation. When you are 10, especially when you are lost and panicking, time can stretch in your mind. A short period can feel much longer than it really was. But it still felt strange. I remember telling my parents about the dog. I told them that I had been lost, sat down under a tree, and then a big dog came out of the bushes. I told them it came over to me, let me pet it, then walked away and kept looking back until I followed it. I told them the dog led me back home. I expected them to turn around and see it. The dog had been right there only moments earlier. I turned around to point it out. But there was nothing. No dog behind me. No large German shepherd moving through the trees. No rustling bushes. No tracks that I could see. No sign of it at all. It had vanished. My parents did not believe me. They probably thought I had made it up because I was scared. Maybe they thought I had gotten turned around, found my way back on my own, and created the dog in my mind to explain how I had done it. Or maybe they thought I had seen a real dog but exaggerated the part about it leading me home. I understand that now. The story sounds impossible. A large dog appears out of nowhere, comforts a lost kid, walks through the woods, and leads them directly back to their house before disappearing without a trace. It sounds like a story someone would tell to make the woods seem magical. But I remember the dog. I remember its fur. I remember the way it nudged my arm. I remember touching it. I remember following it. And I remember seeing my house through the trees after it led me there. I never saw that dog again. I lived there until I was 13, and after that day, I watched for it sometimes. I would go outside and look toward the woods, especially in the areas where I remembered being lost. I thought maybe it belonged to someone farther down the road. Maybe it had wandered away from its home. Maybe it was a farm dog or a hunting dog that knew the woods better than I did. But I never found out. Nobody in town seemed to know of a large German shepherd that matched the dog I remembered. No neighbor ever said, "Oh, that was ours." No one ever told me they had lost a dog that day. It remained a mystery. When I was 13, we moved away. Leaving that house was strange. I had spent so much of my childhood in those woods. I had played there, gotten muddy there, built little shelters there, and had one of the scariest days of my life there. But I also had one of the strangest moments of comfort there. Even now, Every summer when I get the chance, I go back. I visit the forest. I walk around the areas near where I used to live. The trees have changed over time, of course. Some have fallen, new ones have grown. Paths that seemed obvious when I was a kid are harder to find now. The whole place looks smaller in some ways and larger in others. But I still walk through it. I remember being 10 years old. I remember standing alone, not knowing where to go. I remember sitting at the base of that tree, scared and exhausted. And I remember the big dog stepping out of the bushes. I do not know what it was. Maybe it was just a friendly dog that happened to be wandering through the woods at the right time. Maybe it belonged to someone nearby and knew the area well enough to lead me toward the houses. Maybe I had been much closer to home than I realized, and the dog simply walked in a direction that happened to bring me back. Maybe I had not been lost for nearly as long as it felt. All of those explanations are possible. But a part of me still wonders. I wonder why I had never seen that dog before. I wonder why I never saw it again. I wonder why it appeared at the exact moment I gave up. And I wonder why it seemed to know exactly where to go. Whatever the truth is, I will always remember it as the dog that saved me. On one scary day in the woods, when I was 10 years old and thought I was completely alone, it found me. And somehow, it brought me home. When I was 12 years old, my family moved into a house surrounded by a small stretch of woods. It was not completely isolated. There were other houses in the area, and it was not like we were living miles away from civilization. But the property had enough trees around it that the house always felt a little separated from everything else. The woods pressed close in certain places, especially behind the house, and at night the darkness beyond the yard looked much deeper than it probably was. During the day, I liked it. The trees gave the place privacy. There was room outside to walk around, and the yard had that quiet green feeling that made the house seem different from where we had lived before. It felt bigger, older, and more interesting. At 12 years old, moving somewhere new was exciting. I had a new bedroom, a new neighborhood to learn, and a whole house that still felt unfamiliar enough to explore. At night, though, the woods changed the atmosphere. The trees blocked out a lot of light. Wind moved through them in ways that sounded louder than it should have. Branches shifted against one another. Leaves scraped across the ground. Animals moved through the brush where you could hear them, but not see them. Even when there was nothing outside, the darkness made it easy to imagine that something was. Not long after we moved in, we started hearing little comments from people. Nothing direct at first. Someone would mention that the house had a history. Someone else would lower their voice and say that a man had died there. Eventually, we heard the rumor more clearly. Apparently, a man had committed suicide in the house before we lived there. Nobody in my family took it too seriously. We assumed people were messing with us. That happens when you move into an older house, especially one near the woods. Neighbors hear that a new family has moved in, and suddenly everyone has a story. Someone says the old owner saw things. Someone says there was a death in the basement. Someone says the place had been empty for years because nobody wanted to live there. It is easy for rumors to grow around a house. At first, we laughed it off. The house seemed normal. It had creaky floors, old doors, and the occasional strange sound, but so did plenty of other houses. Nothing about it immediately made us think there was anything wrong. Then small things started happening. The first few incidents were easy to dismiss. We would hear dishes rattle in the drying rack in the kitchen. It would sound like someone had bumped the counter or brushed a hand against the metal rack. Plates would tap together softly. glasses would click. Sometimes it was only a quick little shake. Then, nothing. At first, we blamed the house settling. Maybe the counters shifted slightly when someone walked upstairs. Maybe a truck passed on the road and caused a vibration. Maybe the dishwasher or washing machine had been running somewhere nearby. But sometimes it would happen when the house was completely still. No one in the kitchen. No one walking around. No machine running. Just a faint clatter from the drying rack, as if someone had reached over and touched the dishes. There were footsteps too. Those were harder to ignore. The staircase was near the center of the house, and certain steps creaked more than others. We all knew which ones they were. If someone walked up the stairs, you could usually tell where they were by the sound. There would be a creak near the bottom, another one in the middle, then the soft thud of someone reaching the landing. Sometimes, late at night, I would hear footsteps going up and down those stairs when everyone was supposed to be asleep. At first, I assumed it was one of my brothers. Maybe someone had gone to the kitchen for water. Maybe one of my parents was getting up. Maybe someone had been using the bathroom. But then I would listen more carefully and realize the sound did not stop where it should have. The footsteps would go upstairs. Then nothing. No bedroom door opening. No light switching on. No voices. No toilet flushing. No sound of someone getting into bed. Just the final creak near the top of the stairs, followed by silence. Other times, I would hear the footsteps come down. Again, there would be no one there. I would sit in my room, listening, trying to decide whether I should open the door and look. Usually, I did not. I was too scared of finding someone standing in the hallway. The house also had a front door made of steel. It was heavy and loud when it opened or closed. You could not quietly slip through it without someone hearing. When the door moved, you heard the metal shift in the frame. You heard the latch. You heard the weight of it. One day, I was home completely alone. I do not remember exactly why. Maybe everyone else was at work, school, or running errands. I only remember that I knew nobody else was supposed to be in the house. I was doing something normal, probably sitting in my room or watching television, when I heard the front door open. The sound was unmistakable. The metal door shifted. The latch clicked. Then it closed again. For a second, I thought one of my parents must have come home early. I waited for someone to call my name. Nothing. I listened for footsteps on the floor downstairs. At first, I did not hear anything. Then I heard footsteps moving through the house. They went toward the staircase. I remember standing up slowly, trying to listen without making noise. I waited for whoever had come in to say something. I expected to hear one of my brothers, one of my parents, or maybe a friend of the family. But nobody spoke. The footsteps started climbing the stairs. Creak, creak, creak. They moved upward, one step at a time. I was frozen where I stood. I knew I should probably call out. I should have said, "Who's there?" I should have gone downstairs to check whether someone had come in. But I did not. The idea that somebody had entered the house without speaking made me too nervous to move. The footsteps reached the top of the stairs. Then they stopped. I waited. Nothing happened. No one came down the hallway. No one knocked on my door. No one opened a bedroom door. No one said my name. After a while, I finally forced myself to check. I walked through the house slowly, looking in every room. I checked the stairs. I looked downstairs. I looked toward the front door. The door was shut, locked. There was nobody inside. I do not remember finding any sign that someone had come in. No bag on the floor, no car in the driveway, no note, no explanation. I tried to tell myself that I had misheard it. Maybe the steel door had shifted in its frame because of wind. Maybe some other sound had echoed through the house and my mind turned it into footsteps. Maybe someone had come in and left again before I looked. But I knew what I had heard. I heard the door. Then I heard someone walk upstairs. After that, I started paying more attention to the house. Every weird noise felt more important. When dishes rattled, I noticed. When the stairs creaked, I stopped what I was doing and listened. When the front door made even the smallest sound, I looked toward it. The worst part was that none of the incidents were dramatic enough for anyone else to fully believe. There were no objects flying across rooms, no voices shouting, no shadows crossing the walls. Just small things that could always be explained away if you wanted to explain them away badly enough. Until one night when I went to the bathroom. It was late, probably after everyone else had gone to sleep. My bedroom was down the hall from the bathroom, and the lights were off throughout most of the house. I had gotten used to walking through the darkness, especially when I did not want to wake anyone. I stepped out of my room and started toward the bathroom. Then I felt someone standing outside the door. It was not something I saw. The hallway was too dark for that. It was something I felt. You know how you can sense the shape of a room in the dark after living somewhere for a while? You know where the walls are. You know where furniture should be. You can move around without bumping into things because your body has learned the space. That was how this felt at first. I sensed a shape in the hallway. But it was not furniture. It was too tall, too narrow, too solid. It felt like a person standing directly outside the bathroom door. I could somehow make out the outline without seeing it. I could feel the height, the broadness of the shoulders, the space it took up. It seemed like a tall man standing there, close enough that I would have walked right into him if I kept moving. My first thought was that it was one of my older brother's friends. That was the only normal explanation I could think of. Maybe someone had stayed over. Maybe one of them had come out of a room and was standing there in the dark. Maybe he had not heard me approach. I remember reaching toward the light switch. I did not say anything. I was too half awake and too confused. My fingers found the switch. I turned it on. The hallway filled with light. There was nobody there. No brother, no friend, no tall man. No one standing by the bathroom door, just an empty hallway. I stood there for a few seconds, staring at the place where I had felt him. The feeling did not disappear right away. Even after the light came on, I still felt like someone had been there a second earlier. Like the shape had only vanished because I looked directly at it. I went into the bathroom, but I could not relax. I kept glancing at the doorway. I kept expecting to see a shadow cross the hall. Nothing did. I went back to my room afterward and told myself it was fatigue. Maybe I had woken up too quickly. Maybe my eyes had not adjusted. Maybe I had sensed the edge of a wall, a towel rack, or something else, and my mind turned it into a person. But I knew the hallway. I knew where everything was. And whatever I had felt had been taller than me, close enough that it seemed to block the doorway. Still, I tried to forget it. The incident that scared me the most happened years later, when I was around 17. By then, I had lived in the house long enough to be used to the smaller things. I was still uneasy sometimes, but I had learned to ignore a lot of it. The rattling dishes became just the dishes. The footsteps became probably the house. The front door sound became maybe the wind. That was how I dealt with it. You can only stay terrified for so long before your mind starts making excuses for everything. That night, I was up late in my room on the computer. It was around 4 in the morning. Everyone else was asleep. The house was quiet. The only light in my room came from the computer screen. Back then, staying up late online felt normal. I was probably browsing random websites, reading things, chatting, watching videos, or just clicking through whatever held my attention. I was tired, but not tired enough to go to bed yet. The room felt normal at first. My windows were closed. The door was shut. The computer hummed softly. Nothing moved. Then, I felt cold air brush across my left shoulder. It was sudden enough that I noticed immediately. Not the general cold of a room at night. A distinct cold breeze. It passed over my shoulder and the side of my neck, almost like someone had opened a window behind me. I turned and checked the windows. They were closed. I checked them properly. The latches were shut. There was no gap, no curtain moving, no wind coming through. I remember standing there for a moment, confused. Maybe the air conditioning had turned on. Maybe a vent had kicked in. Maybe the house was colder than I realized. But the cold did not feel like it came from a vent. It felt too close. It felt like something had moved directly behind me. I sat back down. A few seconds passed. Then the cold spot moved. It was no longer on my left shoulder. I felt it behind me, then toward my right shoulder. It was like something cold had shifted from one side of my body to the other. I froze. My hands were still near the keyboard, but I stopped typing. I remember staring at the computer screen without seeing anything on it. Every part of my body felt alert. I did not want to turn around. I knew that was irrational, but I could not help it. Something about the cold made me feel like there was someone directly behind my chair. Then the pressure started. At first it was light, a heavy feeling on my shoulders. I thought maybe I was slouching. Maybe I had been sitting too long. Maybe my muscles were tense. But the pressure grew stronger. It pushed down. Not from inside my body, from above. It felt like someone was standing behind me with both hands on my shoulders, forcing me down into the chair. I tried to stand up. I could not. I pushed against the desk. My legs tensed. I tried to lift myself out of the chair with every bit of strength I had. Nothing happened. The pressure held me down. I remember panic rising in my chest so quickly that I could barely think. I tried to tell myself it was sleep paralysis, but I was not in bed. I had been awake, sitting at my computer. I could move my hands. I could move my head. I could breathe. But I could not stand. The feeling was not like weakness. It was like resistance. Like something was physically pushing downward on both shoulders. I tried again. I pushed my feet into the floor. I grabbed the edge of the desk. I twisted my body. The pressure did not let up. I remember shaking my shoulders in wild directions, trying to throw off whatever I felt there. I jerked left, then right. I leaned forward. I tried to pull myself sideways out of the chair. For what felt like forever, I could not get free. Realistically, it was probably only a minute, maybe less. But when you are trapped in your own chair, unable to stand while something invisible seems to be holding you down, a minute feels endless. I remember feeling completely helpless. I remember thinking that nobody else in the house knew what was happening. I remember wanting to scream, but being too scared that if I made noise, whatever was behind me would react. I remember trying not to look over my shoulder. Then, suddenly, the pressure weakened. I do not know what I did differently. Maybe I twisted hard enough. Maybe I finally forced my legs to move. Maybe the feeling simply stopped. But I was able to stand. The moment I got out of the chair, I ran. I did not stop to look behind me. I did not turn on more lights. I did not inspect the room. I ran outside. I remember the cold night air hitting me as I stepped out of the house. The yard was dark. The trees around the property were black shapes against the sky. But I would rather have been outside in the woods than alone in that room. I stood there for a while trying to calm down. My heart was racing. My shoulders still felt strange, like the pressure had left an imprint on them. I kept looking back at the house, especially toward my bedroom window. Nothing looked unusual. The house was still. No lights changed. No figure appeared. No sound came from inside. Eventually, I had to go back in. I did not want to, but it was my home. My family was asleep inside. I could not stay outside forever. So I went back in as quietly as I could, but I did not go straight back to the computer. I avoided that room for the rest of the night. I stayed somewhere closer to other people. I kept lights on. I waited until morning before I went back upstairs. When daylight came, the room looked normal again. The chair was where I had left it. The computer was still on. The windows were closed. Nothing had fallen. Nothing was broken. Nothing could prove that anything had happened. That almost made it worse. If I had found an open window, I could have blamed the cold breeze on that. If I had found something tangled around the chair, I could have blamed the pressure on it. If someone had been awake and seen me struggling, I might have had another perspective. But there was nothing. Just the memory. I have tried to explain it in different ways over the years. Maybe I was exhausted and had a brief episode of sleep paralysis while sitting up. Maybe I had drifted off without realizing it. Maybe my body locked up from panic, and the sensation of being held down came from my own muscles refusing to cooperate. Maybe a cold draft moved through the room even though the windows were closed. Maybe the feeling of pressure was caused by posture, tension, or fear. Maybe every strange sound in that house had a normal explanation, and I connected them because of the rumor we heard when we moved in. Maybe there really had been a man who died there, but that had nothing to do with what I experienced. I do not know. I cannot say for sure that the house was haunted, but I know what it felt like to hear footsteps moving through an empty house. I know what it felt like to hear the steel front door open when no one was home. I know what it felt like to sense the shape of a tall man standing in a dark hallway, then turn on the light and find nothing. And I know what it felt like to sit at my desk at 4 in the morning while something cold moved behind me and pressed me down so hard that I could not stand. The house is no longer just a place I remember from childhood. When I think of it now, I remember the woods around it. I remember the darkness behind the trees. I remember the old staircase creaking in the middle of the night. And I remember the feeling that even when I was alone, I might not have been alone at all. When I was somewhere between 6 and 8 years old, my parents had a routine they followed almost every night. They would put me to bed around 8 o'clock. It was never exactly the same every single night, but close enough that I knew what to expect. I would brush my teeth, change into pajamas, get tucked in, and listen to one of them say goodnight before they left my room. Sometimes my mom would come in last. Sometimes my dad would. Sometimes they would both stand in the doorway for a moment and tell me to get some sleep. After I was in bed, they would usually stay up for another couple of hours. They would sit in the living room, watch TV, talk, or just relax after the day was over. As a kid, I loved knowing they were still awake somewhere else in the house. It made going to bed feel less lonely. Even when I was supposed to be asleep, I could sometimes hear the low sound of the television or catch little pieces of their conversation through the hallway. It was comforting. I knew that if I called out, someone would answer. I knew that if I had a bad dream, my parents were only a short walk away. Our house had a hallway that made the walk from my room to the living room feel longer than it really was. My bedroom door was at the very end of the hall, around a bend. The hallway was shaped like an L. My room sat at the end of the shorter part, almost tucked away from the rest of the house. From my bed, I could not see the living room. I had to leave my room, walk to the end of that first stretch of hallway, turn around the bend, and then continue toward the living room. During the day, it was nothing, just a normal hallway with walls, doors, and family pictures. At night, it felt different. The part around the bend was always darker. You could not see what was in the living room until you got close enough to turn the corner. If the TV was on, its light would sometimes reflect down the hallway in flickering blue and gray flashes. If the lights were off, the hall would be almost completely dark, except for whatever little bit of light came through a window or under a door. That night started like any other. My mom and dad put me to bed at the normal time. I do not remember anything unusual happening before I fell asleep. I was not sick. I had not watched anything especially scary. I was not upset or having trouble sleeping. It just felt like an ordinary night. I remember lying in bed, feeling warm under the blankets, and knowing my parents were still awake in the living room. The house had its usual nighttime sounds, the faint hum of appliances, a soft creak somewhere as the house settled, maybe a low television sound in the distance. Then I fell asleep. I do not know how long I had been asleep when I woke up again, but it was probably around an hour and a half later. The first thing I heard was my dad laughing. It sounded like it was coming from the living room. It was not a loud, wild laugh. It sounded normal, like he was watching something funny on TV, the kind of laugh that makes you curious as a kid because it means something interesting might be happening while you are supposed to be asleep. I remember opening my eyes and immediately thinking that I wanted to get up. I did not have some big plan. I was just a little kid who had heard his dad awake in the living room. In my mind, it was a perfect excuse to leave bed for a while. Maybe I could sit with him. Maybe I could watch TV. Maybe I could pretend I was not tired and avoid having to go straight back to sleep. At that age, any chance to stay up late felt exciting. I lay there for a few seconds, listening. I could hear the television too. The sound was quiet because of the distance, but I recognized it. I vividly remember hearing voices from the animated Star Wars show. I heard Obi-Wan Kenobi and Anakin Skywalker talking. I was a kid, so I had watched enough Star Wars to know those voices. I remember the sound of dialogue coming from the living room mixed with the familiar changing light of the TV. Even from my room, I could see the faint flicker shining down the hallway. That made me even more sure my dad was there. I got out of bed. The floor was cold under my feet, and I remember stepping carefully so I would not make too much noise. I did not want to wake my mom or make my dad tell me to go back to bed immediately. I wanted to sneak out just enough to see what he was watching and maybe sit with him for a few minutes. I walked to my bedroom door. The hallway outside was dark, but I could see the glow from the television reaching around the bend. It was not bright enough to light the whole hallway, but it was enough to make the walls look faintly blue and gray. I remember feeling happy. It was one of those small childhood moments where you think you have discovered something fun. Your parents are up late, the TV is on, and you might be able to sit with them even though you are supposed to be asleep. I opened my bedroom door all the way. The TV voices were still there. I could hear Obi-Wan and Anakin talking. I could see the light moving down the hallway. Then I stepped out of my room. As soon as I started toward the bend in the hallway, everything stopped. The television light disappeared, not slowly, not like someone had changed the channel or turned down the volume. It cut out. The hallway went dark all at once. At the same moment, the voices stopped too. The Star Wars dialogue was gone. The sound of the TV was gone. And the feeling that my dad was sitting in the living room disappeared with it. That is the part that has always bothered me most. There was no sound of someone standing up, no sound of footsteps, no sound of the television being turned off, no sound of the remote clicking, no sound of my dad walking away from the couch. 1 second, everything felt normal. My dad was in the living room, watching TV, laughing at something, and the light from the screen was reaching down the hall. The next second, it was as if the living room had become empty. I stopped where I was. I was standing in the hallway near the bend, looking toward the dark corner ahead of me. For a moment, I thought maybe Dad had just gotten up to turn the TV off. That was the explanation my mind grabbed onto first. Maybe he heard me get out of bed. Maybe he wanted to go to the bathroom. Maybe he was heading into the kitchen. Maybe he had decided it was late and turned everything off before going to bed. That seemed normal enough. But something still felt wrong. I could not explain why. I just remember feeling like the room ahead of me had changed. It was not only darker, it felt empty in a way I could sense before I even turned the corner. Still, I kept walking. I moved slowly down the hallway toward the living room. The closer I got, the more nervous I felt. The hallway was silent, not normal quiet. The kind of quiet that makes you notice your own breathing. I remember feeling ridiculous for being scared. I knew my dad was supposed to be in the living room. I had just heard him. I had just heard the TV. There was no reason to be frightened. But I was. I reached the bend and looked around the corner. The living room was dark. The TV was off. My dad was not there. The couch was empty. There was no movement in the room, no glow from the screen, no sound from the television, no remote click, no sign that anyone had been there at all. I stood there staring. I expected my dad to be in the kitchen or standing near the hallway. I expected him to say something like, "What are you doing up?" I expected him to laugh and tell me to go back to bed. But nothing happened. I took another step into the living room. The room looked exactly like it did after everyone had gone to bed. The furniture sat still in the dark. The television was completely off. There was no blue light, no screen glow, no sound from the speakers. I looked around for my dad. I checked the couch. I looked toward the kitchen. I looked toward the other rooms. Then I called for him. At first, I probably said his name quietly. I did not want to wake my mom. I also did not want to sound scared, even though I was beginning to feel scared. "Dad?" Nothing answered. I called again. A little louder this time. "Dad?" Still nothing. I remember standing in the living room and wondering whether he was playing a joke on me. That was the only thing I could think of. Maybe he had heard me coming and decided to hide. Maybe he was standing somewhere nearby, waiting to jump out and scare me. Maybe he had gone into the kitchen and was trying not to laugh. But that idea made me feel even worse. I did not want him to jump out. I did not want to turn around. I did not want to walk farther into the dark house looking for him. The room felt too big without the television on. When the TV had been playing, the living room felt alive. There was light, dialogue, laughter, and the normal comfort of knowing someone was awake. Now, it felt empty. I remember calling for him one more time. Nothing, no answer from the kitchen. No answer from the hallway. No sound from my parents' room. No footsteps. No laugh. No Star Wars voices. Just silence. That was when I realized I needed to get back to my room. I did not calmly walk back. I ran. I turned around and booked it down the hallway as fast as I could. I remember being terrified that something would be behind me. I remember feeling like I should not look back because if I did, I might see someone standing in the living room doorway. I ran around the bend, back toward my bedroom, and got inside as fast as I could. I shut my door. I probably climbed into bed with my heart pounding. For a while, I lay there staring at the door. I remember listening for footsteps in the hallway. I expected my dad to come down the hall and tell me he had been in the bathroom. I expected my mom to come in and ask why I was out of bed. I expected some normal explanation to arrive. But no one came. The house stayed quiet. Eventually, I realized I was too scared to sleep. I did not want to close my eyes. I did not want to hear the TV turn on again. I did not want to hear my dad laugh from the living room if he was not actually there. I did not want to hear the voices from the Star Wars show coming from a room that was empty. So I stayed awake. I do not remember exactly what time it was by then, but I remember turning on the television in my room or finding something to watch. I ended up staying awake all night watching Nick at Night. Fresh Prince of Bel-Air was on, then George Lopez. I remember watching them because those shows were familiar. They were funny, loud, and normal. The laugh tracks and bright scenes made my room feel less quiet. I did not really care what episodes were playing. I just needed something on. The TV became a shield. As long as there were voices coming from my own television, I did not have to listen for voices from the living room. As long as the screen was bright, I did not have to look at the dark space around my bedroom door. As long as I was watching Fresh Prince or George Lopez, I could pretend I had not heard my dad laughing in an empty room. I stayed up until morning. At some point, the sky outside began to lighten. The house started making morning sounds. I could hear people moving around. Maybe I heard my parents wake up. Maybe I heard doors open and the normal beginning of the day. By then, the fear had changed. It was still there, but it was mixed with confusion. Part of me wondered whether I had dreamed it. Maybe I had been asleep the entire time. Maybe I heard a Star Wars episode in a dream and woke up confused. Maybe I imagined the TV light in the hallway. Maybe I had walked into the living room after waking from a dream and found it dark. Then connected the two things in my mind. That was possible. Kids have vivid dreams. They hear things while half asleep. They wake up disoriented and do not always know how much time has passed. But the memory never felt like a dream to me. I remember getting out of bed. I remember the cold floor. I remember the glow of the TV light coming down the hallway. I remember the specific sound of Obi-Wan and Anakin talking. I remember the light cutting out as I started to turn the corner. And I remember how empty the living room felt when I looked inside. For years, I did not think about it much. It became one of those strange childhood memories that stays in the back of your mind. You remember it clearly when something reminds you, but you do not bring it up often because it sounds weird. I did not tell people because I thought they would say I had a nightmare. Maybe they would have been right. Maybe my dad had been watching TV, then gone to bed, and I only heard him earlier in the night. Maybe I woke up later than I thought. Maybe the Star Wars voices were part of a dream that blended into waking up. Maybe I was so young that I mixed memories together. But I still cannot explain why it felt so real. I still cannot explain why I heard my dad laughing. I still cannot explain why I heard the exact voices from the animated Star Wars show. And I still cannot explain why the light disappeared at the exact moment I stepped out into the hallway. Now that I am older, I want to ask my dad about it. I have thought about bringing it up before, but I always forget. It was such a small moment in the bigger picture of childhood that I never remembered to ask him whether he had been up that night. Maybe he will say he remembers watching Star Wars late at night. Maybe he will say he had gone to bed early. Maybe he will say he was never in the living room at all. I do not know which answer would make me feel better. If he remembers being there, then maybe I can finally explain it. Maybe he had turned the TV off and gone somewhere without me noticing. Maybe the whole thing was ordinary, and I was simply a frightened kid who walked into a dark room. But if he says he was already asleep, then I do not know what I heard. Maybe it was only a dream. Maybe it was an echo of something I had watched earlier. Maybe the house made sounds that my tired mind turned into television voices and laughter. Or maybe, for a few seconds, I heard a normal family night playing out in a room where nobody was actually sitting. Either way, I know one thing. I never forgot the feeling of standing at the end of that hallway. I never forgot the TV light shining down the walls. I never forgot hearing Obi-Wan and Anakin talking in the living room. And I never forgot how quickly all of it disappeared the moment I stepped out of my room. It was around 3 or 4 in the morning when it happened. A few friends and I were driving back after seeing a band. It had been a long night, the kind where everyone is tired but still talking because nobody wants the fun to end yet. We had been out for hours, listening to music, standing around in a crowded venue, probably eating something late afterward, and then finally getting back on the interstate to head home. I was driving. That mattered, because I was getting tired. Not falling asleep at the wheel tired, but tired enough that everyone in the car was helping keep me awake. The music was on, and we were talking between songs. People were telling stories, laughing a little too loudly because we were all worn out, and doing whatever we could to make the drive feel shorter. The road was almost completely empty. It was the middle of the night, far enough from town that there were no streetlights around us, no traffic, and no headlights visible for long stretches. The interstate opened up in front of us like a black ribbon disappearing into the darkness. Every now and then, the headlights would catch a road sign, a guardrail, or the pale line marking the edge of the lane. Other than that, there was nothing to see. No houses, no businesses. No cars passing us, no trucks in the distance, just the road, the sound of the tires, and the music playing low enough that we could still talk. We were the only car on the interstate for what felt like miles. At first, that did not seem strange. It was late. Most people were asleep. We were probably somewhere between towns, heading along a quiet stretch of highway where traffic thinned out after midnight. Still, the emptiness made everything feel larger. When you are driving during the day, you do not think much about the road. There are always other cars nearby. There are exits, signs, gas stations, headlights, and places to stop. But at 3 or 4 in the morning, an empty interstate can make you feel like you are moving through nowhere. There is no one around to see you. No one around to help if your car breaks down. No one around to notice if something goes wrong. I was focused on the road. The speed limit back then was probably around 65, and I was never a huge speeder. I was likely going somewhere between 70 and 75 miles per hour. Nothing crazy. Just fast enough to get home, with the road open in front of me and nobody else around. Then, without warning, there was a car directly in front of us. It was stopped in the middle of the lane. No brake lights, no hazard lights, no headlights. Nothing. 1 second, the road in front of me was clear. The next second, I was almost driving straight into the back of a dark car that was sitting dead still in the lane. I remember the shock of seeing it appear in my headlights. My body reacted before I could think. I yelled something, probably several bad words in a row, and jerked the wheel hard enough to swerve around it. The car moved sideways beneath us. Everyone in my vehicle probably felt the sudden shift. Someone may have grabbed the seat. Someone may have shouted. I barely remember because all I could think about was not hitting that car. We missed it, barely. It was close enough that I remember feeling the rush of air and seeing the shape of the other vehicle flash past beside us. If I had looked down at the radio or blinked at the wrong moment, we would have slammed into it at highway speed. But we got around it. As we passed, I looked over. I do not know why I looked. Maybe I was angry. Maybe I wanted to see what kind of idiot would stop a car in the middle of an interstate with no lights on. Maybe I expected to see someone with a flat tire, a broken down engine, or a person slumped over asleep. I only looked for a second, but I saw enough. The interior light of the car was on. That was the first thing that stood out. The road outside was almost completely dark, but inside their car there was a pale yellowish light. It made the front seats visible as we passed. There was a man sitting behind the wheel. He was facing forward. He was completely still. I remember seeing the shape of his head, his shoulders, his arms near the steering wheel. He did not turn toward us. He did not react when we swerved around him. He did not look over as if he had almost caused an accident. He just sat there, looking straight ahead. In the passenger seat was what looked like a woman. At first, I could not understand how she was positioned. Her feet were up on the dashboard, pointing upward and out. Her legs were spread apart in a way that looked awkward and wrong, but her hips and lower body still seemed to be sitting in the passenger seat normally. Her upper body, though, was turned toward the driver. Her head was resting against his shoulder, not gently, like someone sleeping in the car during a long drive. Not in a relaxed way. It looked limp. Her face was pressed or laid against him, and her body seemed heavy and still. She did not look toward us. She did not move. She did not shift when our headlights passed over the car. Both of them were completely motionless. The entire scene lasted only a second or two. We were already moving past them quickly. I was still trying to recover from almost hitting their car. I did not have time to study their faces or see every detail clearly, but something about the woman made my stomach turn. She looked dead. That was the thought that came into my mind immediately. I hated myself for thinking it. I tried to push it away as soon as it appeared. No, I told myself. She is not dead. Maybe she is asleep. Maybe they were fooling around. Maybe they had stopped for some reason. Maybe she was leaning against him because she was tired or drunk. Maybe it only looked strange because I saw them for 1 second while speeding past in the dark. There had to be some normal explanation. I did not say anything right away. Nobody said anything. For a few seconds after we passed the car, the only sound inside ours was the music and the rush of tires over the road. I was gripping the steering wheel too hard, my heart still racing from the near collision. I kept driving. I did not slow down. I did not turn around. I did not pull over. I just kept going because I was scared, confused, and trying to tell myself it was nothing. Maybe I had misread the situation. Maybe the interior light made everything look stranger than it was. Maybe the woman had been leaning over to pick something up. Maybe her feet were on the dash because she had been relaxing. Maybe the man was just waiting for something. But then someone in the back seat spoke. It was quiet at first. My friend said, "Was that lady dead?" The question changed everything. Until that moment, I had been trying to convince myself that I was the only person who saw it that way. I thought maybe I had let the darkness and exhaustion get into my head. Maybe I had imagined the worst because the car had nearly caused an accident. But my friend had seen it too. They had not heard my thoughts. They had not heard me say anything. They had looked over at the same moment and come to the same conclusion. After that, everyone started talking at once. One person said they thought the woman looked wrong. Another said her body did not look like someone who was just sleeping. Someone else said the man had not even flinched when we almost hit him. We kept trying to remember exactly what we had seen. The more we talked about it, the worse it sounded. The car had been stopped in the middle of the lane with all its exterior lights off. The man had been staring straight ahead. The woman had been twisted toward him with her head against his shoulder. Neither of them had moved. And we were alone on that stretch of interstate. At that point, we were all convinced something bad had happened. Not necessarily a murder. We did not know that. But something about the scene did not look right. We talked about calling the police. We talked about whether we should turn around. We talked about whether the car might have broken down and the people inside needed help. But we were also scared. We were young, tired, and in the middle of nowhere. We had no idea whether there was someone dangerous in that car. We did not know whether the man had a weapon. We did not know whether stopping or turning around would put us in danger. I remember feeling guilty even then. Part of me wanted to help if someone was hurt, but another part of me wanted to get as far away from that car as possible. We had only just barely avoided crashing into it. The fact that the driver had no lights on made it feel intentional, or at least deeply wrong. If it had been a normal breakdown, why were there no hazards? Why was no one outside waving? Why was the car sitting directly in the lane? We kept driving. The road stretched ahead of us, empty and black. For a while, we did not see anything behind us. Then suddenly, headlights appeared in the distance. They came up fast, very fast. At first, I thought it was another car that had been behind us all along. But the lights grew closer much too quickly. Whoever was behind us was moving fast enough that it made everyone in the car quiet. I checked the mirror. The vehicle was closing the distance. Then it came flying past us. It was the same car, the same one we had nearly hit. The interior light was still on. I did not have time to see everything clearly. It passed us too fast. I only had a quick glimpse through the driver's side as it went by. But I saw the man. He was still behind the wheel, and the woman was gone. The passenger seat was empty. That alone would have been enough to scare us. But there was something else. Everyone in my car swore the man was cleaning a knife. I remember seeing his wrists resting high near the steering wheel, as if he was still controlling the car while doing something with his hands. In one hand, it looked like he had a knife. In the other, he seemed to have a cloth or something similar. It looked like he was wiping the blade. I know how unbelievable that sounds. I know that seeing something for only a split second while another car speeds past on a dark interstate is not enough to be certain about every detail. Maybe he was holding something else. Maybe the interior light and the movement made it look like a knife. Maybe it was a tool, a phone, a piece of metal, or something completely harmless. But all of us saw something. And all of us thought it was a knife. The car passed us and disappeared ahead. It did not slow down. It did not pull over. It did not stop again where we could see it. It just sped away into the darkness, the interior light still glowing inside like a small moving box of yellow light. For a few seconds, nobody spoke. Then everyone started talking again, louder this time. We were scared. We were trying to decide whether we had just seen a murder. One person wanted to call the police immediately. Another thought we should not, because we could not give them enough information. We did not have a license plate. We barely knew what kind of car it was. We did not know exactly where we had passed it anymore, because we had kept driving. We were trying to remember whether we had seen blood. I do not think we did. We were trying to remember whether the woman had moved. None of us thought she had. We were trying to remember whether the man had looked at us. I do not think he did. He just looked forward. That image has stayed with me more than anything else. A man sitting behind the wheel, stopped in the middle of an empty interstate, with the inside light on, staring forward while a woman lay against his shoulder. I do not know what happened after that. I do not know if we called the police later. I do not remember whether someone in the car had a phone that worked properly out there, or whether we were too shaken and uncertain to report it. It was the mid-90s, and things were different then. Not everyone had a cell phone in their pocket. You could not instantly look up a highway location, share a live pin, or record everything from your car. Even if we had called, what could we have told them? There was a car stopped in the road, and we think the woman inside might have been dead. That is not nothing, but it is also not much to go on. We did not know the plate. We did not know the make and model for sure. We did not know where the car went. We did not know whether the woman had simply gotten out somewhere before the car passed us again. We did not know whether the object in the man's hand was actually a knife. All we had were a few seconds of terror and a feeling that something deeply wrong had happened right in front of us. Over the years, I have tried to find normal explanations. Maybe the woman was asleep. Maybe she was drunk and had passed out awkwardly against the driver's shoulder. Maybe they had pulled over in the lane because the car had stalled, and the driver had been trying to restart it. Maybe the lights were off because of a dead battery or an electrical problem. Maybe the woman got out during the time between us passing them and them speeding past us. Maybe there was a rest stop, an exit, or a place they pulled over that we did not notice. Maybe the man was cleaning something harmless. Maybe he had been peeling an apple. That is the joke I tell myself sometimes. Maybe some guy decided to stop his car in the middle of I-40 in complete darkness, turn on the interior light, peel an apple with a knife, and let his girlfriend take a strange-looking nap with her feet on the dashboard. Maybe that is all it was. But the explanation never feels convincing. Why stop in the middle of a lane? Why keep the lights off? Why did the woman look so still? Why did the man not react when we nearly hit them? Why was she gone when the car passed us again? And why did everyone in my car see the same thing in his hands? I do not know if we witnessed a murder. I hope we did not. I hope there was some innocent explanation that we could not see because we were tired, scared, and driving past too fast in the dark. But I still think about it sometimes. Usually when I am driving late at night. Usually when I am on an empty highway and the road ahead seems completely clear. I will see a distant pair of taillights or a dark shape near the shoulder. And suddenly, I remember that night. I remember how quickly an ordinary drive turned into something terrifying. I remember the car appearing without lights. I remember swerving around it at highway speed. I remember the yellow interior light glowing against the darkness. And I remember the woman sitting beside the driver, her head resting on his shoulder in a way that did not look like sleep. That is the image I cannot get rid of. Not because I know what happened, but because I never will. I was about 17 years old when I went to Japan on a student exchange trip. It was my first time staying so far from home for that long, and everything felt unfamiliar in the best possible way. I was excited, nervous, and trying to take in as much as I could. The food, the language, the streets, the houses, the shops, the trains. And even the smallest everyday routines all felt different from what I was used to. For the first week of the trip, I stayed with a host family in a small town called Hesami in Nagasaki Prefecture. Hesami was quieter than the bigger cities I had imagined when I first thought about Japan. It was not the kind of place where there were huge crowds everywhere, or bright city lights outside every window. It was a small town with narrow streets, homes close together in some places, and quieter areas where the night seemed to settle in early. My host family was kind to me. They made me feel welcome, even though there was obviously a language barrier at times. We managed through simple conversations, gestures, smiles, and whatever Japanese or English we each knew. They showed me around, fed me, made sure I had what I needed, and did their best to help me feel comfortable. The house was traditional in some ways, with rooms that did not look like the rooms I was used to back home. Most of the family slept downstairs. I was sleeping by myself on the upper floor. Calling it an entire second floor makes it sound larger than it was. It was not some big upstairs area with lots of bedrooms, long hallways, and open spaces. It was a small, narrow part of the house. When you walked up the stairs, there was a short passageway at the top. On one side of that passage was a window that looked out into a narrow alley. On the other side was a sliding door that led into a traditional Japanese family room. That room was where I slept. It had tatami flooring, and it was simple but comfortable. There was a low table, some basic furniture, and an old television sitting on a TV stand. The TV looked older than anything I had at home. It was one of those bulky sets that seemed like it had been in the house for years, maybe even decades. The remote control sat on top of the TV stand. I noticed it the first day, mostly because I wondered whether the host family still used the television, but I never touched it. I did not know what channels were available, and I was not comfortable turning it on by myself in a house that was not mine. It stayed in the same place every day I was there. Behind the family room was another room, separated by a bamboo-style sliding door. At first, I assumed it was another sleeping room or a small storage area. One day, out of curiosity, I opened the door and looked inside. It was a storeroom. There were piles of things in there. Boxes, old household items, blankets, bags, and objects that looked like they had been collected over many years. It was not dirty exactly, but it had that heavy, closed-in feeling that storage rooms often have. The air smelled older in there, like dust, fabric, wood, and things that had not been moved for a long time. As I looked around, I noticed a couple of traditional Japanese dolls. They were inside transparent cases. I know that those dolls are important cultural items, and I do not mean any disrespect toward them at all. But I was 17, alone in a strange house, and already adjusting to a completely different environment. Seeing old dolls in a dim storage room made me uneasy in a way I could not fully explain. They were beautiful in their own way. They had carefully made clothes and detailed faces, but there is something about old dolls, especially dolls sitting silently inside clear cases, that can make a room feel different when you are alone. I did not touch anything. I only looked for a few seconds, then quietly slid the door shut again. After that, I tried not to think much about the storage room. For the first 2 nights, everything was completely fine. The house was quiet at night, but that was normal. The host family would go to bed downstairs, and I would go upstairs to the tatami room. I would lay out my futon, turn off the lights, and try to sleep. Sleeping in a futon was different from sleeping in my own bed, but I got used to it quickly enough. It was actually more comfortable than I expected. The room itself was peaceful during the day. Light came through the window. I could hear small sounds from the house below. Sometimes I could hear people talking downstairs, dishes being moved, or doors sliding open and shut. At night, though, the upper floor felt very separate from the rest of the home. Once I closed the sliding door and the lights were off, I was alone up there. The staircase was just outside. The narrow passage was dark. The window looked out into the alley, and the old television sat only a few feet away from where I slept. The futon was placed around 5 feet from the TV stand. I could see the dark shape of the screen from my bedding whenever I opened my eyes. During the day, it was just an old TV. At night, when the room was dark, the blank screen seemed larger. It reflected faint shapes from the window and bits of light from outside, but otherwise it was only a black rectangle facing the room. I was not particularly frightened at first. I was tired after long days of travel and student activities. I had plenty to think about. I was focused on being polite to my host family, learning new things, and enjoying the trip. Still, the upper floor had a certain atmosphere at night. The house made sounds. Wood creaked. Something in the walls would occasionally click. Wind would brush against the outside of the building. Sometimes I could hear distant sounds from the alley through the window. A bicycle passing. Someone walking. A vehicle moving farther down the road. The quiet hum of a town settling down for the night. I told myself that all of it was normal. Then came the third night. It was cold outside. I remember that clearly because winter had settled in, and the air in the upper floor felt colder than the rest of the house. I had my futon pulled around me and was trying to get comfortable enough to sleep. The room was dark. The television was off, and the only light came faintly through the window. I do not remember the exact time, but it was around 12:30 in the morning. I had not been fully asleep yet. I was in that uncomfortable stage where your body is tired, your eyes are closed, but your mind is still aware of every small sound around you. That was when I heard something outside. At first, I thought it was a vehicle. The sound came from the direction of the alley, somewhere near the window. It sounded like wheels rolling over hard ground, but it was not the smooth sound of a car. It was rougher and slower. It sounded like someone pushing a warehouse trolley, the kind of trolley with heavy things loaded onto it. I could hear the uneven roll of the wheels, followed by a faint rattling sound. It seemed like something metal was moving over pavement or concrete. Every few seconds there was a small clunk, as if the wheels were catching on cracks in the ground. The sound was not extremely loud, but in the silence of that upper floor, it stood out. I opened my eyes. For a moment, I just listened. The window was on the other side of the narrow passage, and I could not see directly outside from where I was lying. I would have had to get up, go through the sliding door, step into the hallway, and look out. I did not feel like doing that. I was tired, and there was nothing especially impossible about someone moving something through an alley late at night. Maybe a person was taking out rubbish. Maybe someone was delivering goods early. Maybe the sound was coming from farther away than it seemed. I remember thinking that it was weird but not terrifying. Not yet. The rolling sound continued for a little longer. Then it stopped. The silence afterward was immediate. No footsteps. No voices. No more rattling wheels. Just nothing. I lay there for a few seconds, listening, then I closed my eyes again. That was when the television switched on. The sound hit first. A sudden blast of static filled the room. It was loud enough to make me sit up immediately. The screen came to life with that blurred gray-white snow effect that old televisions used to show when they were on a channel with no signal. The room flashed with flickering light. The static sound was harsh and constant, filling the quiet space in a way that made it feel much louder than it probably was. For a second, I could not move. I stared at the TV. The screen was bright. The static rolled across it in waves. The sound crackled through the room. And I knew I had not turned it on. I had never touched the remote control. I had never used that television. The remote was still on the stand where it had been since I arrived. I had noticed it every day because it never moved. Nobody had come upstairs to use the TV while I was there. Nothing strange had happened during the first 2 nights. But now, the television was on. At around 12:30 in the morning, right after the sound outside stopped, the 17-year-old version of me completely panicked. I did not sit there trying to find a reasonable explanation. I did not inspect the remote. I did not check the buttons on the television. I did not think about power surges, wiring problems, or old electronics. I just wanted the thing off. I jumped out of the futon, moved across the tatami floor, and unplugged the entire television from the outlet. Not just turned it off, unplugged it. The static stopped immediately. The screen went black. The room became quiet again. I remember standing there for a moment, still holding the plug, staring at the dark screen. The silence felt wrong after the static. A second earlier, the room had been filled with noise and flashing light. Now it was completely dark again, except for the faint glow coming through the window. I looked toward the sliding door. I looked toward the hallway. I thought about the alley outside. I thought about the sound of the trolley. And I thought about the storeroom behind the bamboo sliding door. I did not want to think about the dolls, but my mind went there anyway. I remembered the transparent cases. I remembered the quiet, dusty room. I remembered how the dolls' faces had looked in the low light. I knew it was probably irrational. I knew there was no logical reason to connect an old television turning on to some dolls in a storage room. But when you are 17, sleeping alone in a strange house in another country, with an unfamiliar room behind you and no one else on your floor, your brain does not always choose the calmest explanation. I stood there for a while, trying to decide whether I should go downstairs and wake someone. Part of me wanted to. I wanted to tell my host family that their television had turned on by itself. I wanted to ask if something was wrong with it. I wanted to know whether the sound outside was normal. I wanted another person nearby. But I was embarrassed. I did not want to disturb them in the middle of the night over something that might have a simple explanation. I was a guest in their home. I did not want to seem rude, dramatic, or childish. And I had no way to explain the situation easily. Even if I woke them up, I would have to try to describe the rolling sound outside, the TV static, and the fact that I had unplugged their television because it scared me. So I decided not to say anything. I plugged nothing back in. I left the TV unplugged. Then I went back to the futon. I lay down again, but I did not sleep well. Every small sound in the house became more noticeable. A creak from downstairs made me tense. The wind near the alley made me open my eyes. The pipes making a faint noise in the wall sounded louder than they should have. I kept expecting the television to turn back on, even though I had unplugged it. I knew it could not. But when you are scared, logic does not always calm you down. You can know something is impossible and still wait for it to happen. I kept looking toward the TV stand. The screen stayed dark. The room stayed quiet. Nothing else happened that night. Eventually, exhaustion won, and I must have fallen asleep. The next morning, I woke up with that strange feeling you get after a bad night, when you are not sure whether something truly happened or whether you dreamed it. For a few seconds, I wondered if I had imagined the entire thing. Then I saw the unplugged cable. The television was still disconnected from the wall. The remote control was still on the TV stand. Everything was exactly where it had been. I plugged the television back in later, during the daytime. I did not turn it on right away. I just plugged it back in because I felt strange, leaving a host family's TV unplugged without saying anything. I expected it to start showing static again the moment it had power, but it did not. It stayed off. Normal, silent, nothing else happened with it. I did not tell my host family about what had happened. I considered asking them whether the TV had electrical problems, but I never found the right moment. Every time I thought about bringing it up, it sounded silly in my head. Your TV turned itself on after I heard something outside. I did not want to say that. Maybe they would have explained that the television had a timer. Maybe the remote was faulty. Maybe the old TV had a loose connection. Maybe there had been a power interruption. Maybe they would have looked confused and thought I was making it up. So I kept it to myself. I stayed in that house for a few more days before moving to another host family's place. Nothing else happened. The TV did not turn on by itself again. I never heard the trolley sound outside again. I never saw anything in the alley. The dolls remained in their cases in the storeroom, exactly where I had seen them before. I avoided opening that sliding door again unless I had a reason to. During the rest of my stay, I still felt uneasy when I went upstairs at night. I would notice the television sitting there. I would notice the passageway outside the room. I would hear the soft sounds of the house and wonder whether something would happen again. But it never did. Years later, when I told people about the experience, most of them had the same reaction. They said it was probably an electrical problem. They said old televisions can turn on by themselves. They said maybe the remote had a stuck button, or the TV had some kind of timer setting, or there was a power issue that caused it to switch on. They also said the trolley sound probably had nothing to do with it. Maybe somebody really was pushing something through the alley. Maybe a neighbor was moving supplies. Maybe there was a delivery or a business nearby. Maybe it was just a coincidence that the sound stopped right before the TV came on. And honestly, they could be right. That is the most reasonable explanation. An old TV can have a fault. A remote can malfunction. Electrical systems can behave strangely. And people move things around late at night for normal reasons. The part that still bothers me is the timing. The rolling sound stopped. I closed my eyes, and the television switched itself on with static. It happened so quickly after one another that it felt connected, even if it probably was not. It is also possible that I was already more nervous than I realized because of the storage room. Seeing the traditional dolls had unsettled me. I do not think the dolls were evil. I do not think they caused anything. I know they were just objects that belonged to the family and probably had personal or cultural meaning. But I was a teenager in a strange place. I was alone on the upper floor. I had already seen those dolls sitting in their transparent cases among old stored belongings. Then I heard something moving outside in the dark. Then an old television suddenly filled the room with static. Of course I panicked. Maybe the dolls did not cause the fear. Maybe they only gave my mind something frightening to focus on afterward. Even now, I cannot say that anything supernatural happened. I cannot say the house was haunted. I cannot say the sound outside was connected to the television. There may have been a perfectly ordinary reason for every part of it. But I still remember the room. I remember the cold winter air. I remember lying in the futon, trying to sleep. I remember the sound of wheels rolling slowly through the alley. I remember the silence after they stopped. And I remember opening my eyes to see the old TV glowing in the dark, its screen full of static, as if somebody had turned it on just to make sure I was awake. I was about 14 or 15 years old when this happened. I was home alone in the living room late at night, watching an NBA game. I had always liked sitting on the floor close to the TV. I do not know why exactly. Maybe it made the game feel more intense, like I was closer to the court somehow. Maybe I just found it more comfortable than sitting on the couch. Either way, I was sitting right in front of the television, close enough that the screen filled most of my view. The living room was dark except for the light from the TV. The game was on, the commentators were talking, and the sound of the crowd kept rising and falling in the background. Every now and then, there would be a loud reaction after a shot or a turnover. Then, the noise would settle again. It was one of those late-night games where you are tired, but you do not want to go to bed until it is over. My mom was asleep in her room. The rest of the house was quiet. We lived pretty far out of town, around 30 minutes away from anything that could really be called a neighborhood. There were no houses close by. No nearby kids playing outside. No people walking down the street. No apartments next door where you could hear someone's television or music through the walls. At night, it was extremely quiet there. During the day, the isolation did not bother me much. It was just where we lived. You could see open land, trees, long stretches of road, and darkness beyond the porch light. But at night, especially when everyone else in the house was asleep, the quiet could feel heavy. You would notice every small sound. A branch scraping against a window, the wind moving through trees, an animal somewhere in the yard, a car passing far down the road. Even the house itself made noises that sounded louder at night. The floor would creak. Pipes would click. The walls would settle. Normally, I could ignore those sounds because they were familiar. But that night, I heard something that did not sound familiar at all. I was watching the game when I heard a whistle. It was crystal clear, not a random high-pitched noise, not wind blowing through something outside, not a bird, not a sound from the TV. It sounded like a person standing outside on the porch to my right, whistling a simple, cheerful tune. The whistle had a rhythm to it. It was not long or complicated, but it was clearly intentional. A few notes, almost playful. The kind of tune somebody might whistle while walking down the street or doing something around the house. What made it worse was that I could hear the breath behind it. It was not just the notes. I could hear the faint human sound between them, the little rush of air that comes from someone breathing in before they whistle again. The second I heard it, I froze. I stopped paying attention to the game completely. For a moment, I did not even look toward the porch. I was too scared to move. My body reacted before my mind could make sense of it. My stomach dropped. My heart started beating faster, and every thought in my head became focused on one thing. Someone was outside. The porch was directly to the right of the living room. There was a window there with curtains drawn over it. The porch light had been left on, so the outside area should have been visible enough to make out anyone standing nearby. If a person was outside the window, I should have seen their shadow. That was the first thing I thought. I slowly turned my head toward the curtain. I expected to see a dark shape standing behind it. I expected to see a person's head, shoulders, or body blocking the porch light. I expected to see movement. I expected to see somebody standing close enough to the window that they could look inside. But there was nothing. The curtain hung completely still. No shadow crossed it. No feet appeared beneath it. No hand touched the glass. No figure moved past the window. I just sat there on the floor, staring at the curtain. The game was still playing behind me. The announcers were talking. The crowd was cheering about something. But all of it sounded far away now. I was not watching the game anymore. I was watching the curtain, waiting for it to move. I remember feeling completely trapped. I did not want to stand up because I thought that movement might make whoever was outside realize I had heard them. I did not want to turn the TV down because the sudden silence would make it obvious that I was listening. I did not want to call my mom because I was afraid she would tell me I was overreacting. At the same time, I did not want to stay where I was. I kept telling myself it had to be something normal. Maybe it was the TV. Maybe one of the players or announcers had whistled, and the sound had seemed like it came from outside because of the way the room was arranged, but I knew it had not come from the television. The whistle had sounded too close. It had come from the right side of the room, directly near the porch. It had sounded like it was just beyond the curtain. Maybe it was wind. But there was no wind strong enough that night to create a tune. And even if wind had passed through a crack or a pipe somehow, it would not have sounded like a person whistling with breath behind every note. Maybe it was an animal. That was possible, I guess. There are animals that can make strange noises. Birds can imitate sounds. Some animals cry, scream, chirp, or make noises that sound almost human. But this was not an animal sound. I knew the difference. It sounded like a human being standing outside and casually whistling. I sat there staring at the curtain for what felt like hours. Realistically, it was probably only a minute. But fear stretches time in a way nothing else does. Every second felt too long. I was waiting for another whistle. I was waiting for a knock. I was waiting for the curtain to move. I was waiting for the porch light to flicker or go out. Nothing happened. Eventually, I forced myself to stand. I did it slowly. I remember keeping my eyes on the curtain the entire time. My legs felt weak, and I was trying not to make too much noise. The floor felt cold under my feet. The room felt much bigger than it normally did, like there was too much empty space between me and the window. I took one step, then another. The closer I got to the curtain, the worse the fear became. From across the room, I could still pretend there was nothing out there. But once I was right in front of the window, I would know. I would either see an empty porch or see someone staring back at me. I stood beside the curtain for a few seconds, unable to make myself move it. The TV behind me was still on. The basketball game continued as if nothing was wrong. I remember thinking how stupid the situation felt. There I was, terrified of a curtain in my own living room, while a game played in the background. If someone had walked in and seen me, they probably would have laughed. But I could not make myself laugh. I grabbed the edge of the curtain and pulled it back just enough to look through. The porch was empty. The light was on. The steps were empty. The yard beyond the porch looked dark and still. There was no person standing near the window, no one hiding beside the door, no shadow crossing the ground, no car in the driveway that I did not recognize. Nothing. I looked farther out into the darkness. The porch light only reached so far. Beyond the edge of it, everything disappeared into blackness. The trees looked like dark shapes against a darker sky. There could have been anything farther out there, and I would not have been able to see it. That thought made me pull the curtain closed again immediately. I did not go outside. There was no way I was going outside. I did not even want to unlock the door. I did not want to stand on the porch and look around. I did not want to call out and ask if anyone was there. I did not want to give whoever might be outside any reason to know I was afraid. So I went back to the floor and sat down in front of the TV again. I tried to resume watching the game. I tried to convince myself that I had imagined the whistle. Maybe I was tired. Maybe I had been so focused on the game that a sound from the TV had confused me. Maybe the house made a weird noise. Maybe I had heard something from far away, and my mind turned it into a human whistle. I kept the volume up. I did not want silence. The sound of the game filled the living room, and for a little while, I managed to focus on it again. I watched the players move up and down the court. I listened to the commentators. I tried to pay attention to the score, but I kept looking toward the curtain. Every few seconds, I would glance at it. The porch light still shone through the edges. The curtain never moved. Around 30 minutes passed. I had started to calm down a little. Not completely, but enough that I was starting to feel embarrassed by my own fear. I thought maybe I really had overreacted. I thought maybe I would wake up the next day and laugh about how scared I had been over a sound that probably came from the TV. Then it happened again. Another whistle. This time, it was different. It was still cheerful, still simple, still clearly human. But the tune was not the same as before. The first whistle had been only a short pattern of notes. This one had a slightly different rhythm, almost like whoever was outside had decided to whistle a new little melody. And again, it sounded like it came from the porch. Right outside the curtain. I did not freeze this time. I freaked out. The first whistle had made me unsure. I could still tell myself I had misunderstood it, but hearing it a second time, with a different tune, removed that possibility. It was not a sound from the TV repeating. It was not a random creak. It was not a bird making the same strange noise. Someone or something was whistling outside. I jumped up and ran to my mom's room. I did not care anymore if she thought I was crazy. I did not care if I woke her up. I did not care if I sounded stupid. I told her there was someone outside on the porch. I told her someone had been whistling at me through the window. I told her I had heard it once, checked the porch, saw nobody, then heard it again 30 minutes later. My mom was scared and confused at the same time. At first, I think she probably assumed I had heard something ordinary. Maybe she thought an animal was in the yard. Maybe she thought I had mistaken something from the TV for a sound outside. But when she saw how frightened I was, she got up. We went through the house together. Every light suddenly seemed too bright. The hallway felt strange. The living room felt different now that I was not alone in it. I remember standing near my mom while she checked the doors and windows. She looked through the front window, then the porch window. She checked the locks. She looked outside. There was no one there. We went around the inside of the house first. Every room was empty. Every door was closed or locked the way it should have been. There was no sign that anyone had come inside. Then we checked outside. I did not want to go, but I stayed close to my mom. The porch light made the front area visible, but only barely. It threw a yellowish circle over the steps and part of the yard. Beyond that, the darkness was thick. We looked around the porch. Nothing. We checked near the windows. Nothing. We looked toward the driveway. Nothing. We looked around the side of the house. Nothing. There were no footprints that we could see. No car, no person hiding behind something. No sign that anyone had been standing near the porch just minutes earlier. My mom eventually told me it was nothing to worry about. She tried to reassure me. Maybe it was an animal. Maybe it was someone driving past. Maybe the sound had come from somewhere farther away than I thought. Maybe the wind had carried someone's whistle from the road. But that never made sense to me. We lived too far from town. There were no neighbors close enough for someone to be standing outside their own house and have their whistle sound like it was right outside ours. There were no groups of kids walking around at that hour. There were no nearby houses where someone could have been playing a prank. And even if someone had been trying to prank us, why would they choose our porch? Why would they whistle twice, then disappear without making any other sound? Why would they stand in the dark outside a house in the middle of nowhere just to whistle a cheerful tune? I did not sleep much that night. I do not remember whether I stayed in my own room or slept closer to my mom. I only remember lying awake and listening. Every sound outside made me tense. The trees moving in the wind sounded like footsteps. The house settling sounded like someone walking through the hallway. A car passing somewhere far away made me imagine headlights turning into our driveway. And every time the TV noise stopped in my memory, I could hear that whistle again. Clear, cheerful, human. The worst part was how normal it sounded. If the whistle had been strange, distorted, or obviously threatening, I might have been able to explain why it scared me. But it was not. It sounded casual, almost happy. That made it worse. It sounded like someone who was comfortable standing outside our house in the dark. It sounded like someone who knew I was inside. It sounded like someone trying to get my attention without knocking. I thought about whether the person outside could see me through the curtain. The porch light was on, but the living room was also lit by the TV. If someone had been standing near the window, maybe they could see the movement of the screen. Maybe they could see me sitting on the floor. Maybe they knew exactly where I was. That thought made my skin crawl. I kept imagining a face just outside the curtain. I imagined someone standing perfectly still while I sat on the floor watching the game, unaware they were there. I imagined them whistling only after they noticed I was alone. I imagined them leaving the moment my mom came into the room. Nothing ever happened after that night. There were no more whistles that I remember. Nobody came back. There was no sign of someone trying to get inside. No broken lock. No strange car waiting nearby. No explanation from a neighbor. No one admitting they had been outside. It was just those two whistles. I have tried to explain it to myself over the years. Maybe it was a bird. There are birds that can make surprisingly human sounds. Maybe there was some kind of bird in a tree near the porch that copied a whistle. Maybe the tune sounded different the second time because it was not a person at all. But I could hear the breath behind it. That is what I remember most clearly. It was not just a sound that rose and fell like a whistle. It had the little pauses between notes. It had the sound of someone breathing in, then blowing again. Maybe it was an animal that could mimic a whistle better than I realized. Maybe it was the wind moving through something outside in a way that only sounded human because I was scared. Maybe there was a person far away, and the quiet of the countryside carried the sound farther than I expected. All of those things are possible, but none of them feel right. The whistle did not sound far away. It sounded close enough that I expected to see someone's shadow on the curtain. It sounded like it came from directly outside the porch window. And when I looked, there was nobody there. That is what has stayed with me. Not the NBA game. Not even the fear of a stranger standing outside. It is the feeling of sitting alone in a dark living room, hearing something cheerful and human just a few feet away, then looking toward the window and seeing nothing at all. Even now, if I hear someone whistle outside at night, I think about that porch. I think about the curtain. I think about the light shining outside while the darkness waited beyond it. And I remember the sound of someone whistling a happy little tune where nobody should have been. When I was little, somewhere around 3 years old until the beginning of 4th grade, I used to play with something on the wall beside my bed. I called it Mr. Face. It was not a drawing. At least, nobody had drawn it there on purpose. It was part of the wall itself, or at least it seemed that way to me. My bedroom walls were painted baby blue, and whatever Mr. Face was had almost the exact same color as the wall. That made it difficult to see most of the time. You could not walk into the room, look at the wall, and immediately notice it. You had to be standing or lying at a certain angle. You had to look at the wall in just the right light. Then, the shape would slowly appear. It was right beside my bed, close enough that I could see it whenever I turned my head toward that side of the room. Sometimes it looked faint, almost like nothing more than a strange pattern in the paint. Other times, especially when the room was dark, or the light from outside came in a certain way, it looked much clearer. That was when I could see the face. Even as a small child, I knew it looked creepy. It had two different sides, like two faces had been pressed together into one. One side reminded me of the anonymous mask, with that pale, smooth look and a strange, curved expression. The other side reminded me of one of the Titans from Attack on Titan, especially the parts of their faces that looked stretched and wrong. It was not exactly like either one, but that is the closest comparison I can make now that I am older. The most noticeable thing about it was the smile. Mr. Face had a very wide smile, not a normal smile. It looked stretched out too far, as if it covered more of the face than it should. The shape of it seemed to pull toward both sides of the wall, like somebody had taken a regular smile and widened it until it became something unsettling. When I was little, it scared me a little, but it also comforted me. That is the part that is hardest to explain. Most people would probably hear about a creepy face appearing on a child's bedroom wall and assume it was something I should have been afraid of. And there were times when I was. Sometimes I would lie in bed at night and look toward it, and the smile would seem wider than I remembered. Sometimes the shadows in my room would make one side of the face look darker, almost like it was staring at me more closely. But I never thought Mr. Face wanted to hurt me. It was creepy, yes, very creepy. But it was also familiar. When you are little, familiar things can become comforting even when they are strange. Children get attached to odd things. A shadow in a corner. A stuffed animal with one missing eye. A creak in the house that happens every night. A shape in the curtains. A voice from the television in another room. For me, Mr. Face became one of those things. I talked to it all the time. I do not remember every conversation, but I remember talking to it as if it was another person in the room. I would tell it things that happened during the day. I would talk about school. I would tell it when I was upset. I would probably complain about my parents, my siblings, or anything else that seemed important to a small kid. Sometimes I made up games with it. I would ask questions and then pretend I knew the answer. I would stare at it from my bed and imagine that the face had changed slightly. I would look away, then look back, almost expecting it to be in a different position. Sometimes I would cover my eyes for a few seconds, uncover them, and see whether Mr. Face was still there. It always was. At least, whenever I looked from the right angle. I do not know exactly when I first noticed it. Maybe I saw the shape in the paint one night while I was trying to sleep. Maybe I was playing on my bed and noticed that part of the wall looked different from the rest. Maybe sunlight hit the wall in a certain way, and the face suddenly appeared. However it started, I remember that it felt like something I discovered for myself. Nobody had told me about it. Nobody had pointed it out. It was mine. I think that was part of why I became attached to it. Mr. Face was something that existed in my room, beside my bed, where nobody else seemed to notice it. It did not belong to my parents. It did not belong to anyone at school. It was not something adults talked about or explained. It was just there, and because it was always there, I started treating it like a friend. Not exactly a normal friend. Even as a little kid, I knew there was something unsettling about it. I knew it did not look like a friendly cartoon face. It had that strange, stretched smile, and one side of it looked more disturbing than the other. If I saw the same shape somewhere else, like in an abandoned building or on a dark wall outside, it probably would have terrified me. But it was in my room. It was beside my bed. It had been there for so long that it became part of the place where I felt safest. There were nights when I would lie in bed and feel scared of the dark, but then I would look at the wall and see Mr. Face, somehow, that made the room feel less empty. It was like there was someone there with me. That sounds creepy now. Honestly, when I say it out loud, I know it sounds creepy. A child talking to a face in a wall is the kind of story people tell when they are trying to make a haunted house story sound more disturbing. It sounds like the beginning of a movie where everyone ignores the kid until something bad happens. But when I was little, it did not feel like that. Mr. Face was not an enemy. It was just there. Sometimes I would stare at it for a long time, trying to understand what I was seeing. The face was not always equally visible. On some days, it seemed almost completely gone. I would look at the wall and see nothing but baby blue paint. Then I would shift my position slightly, or lie down on my bed, or look at it from near the doorway, and the shape would come back. The outline of the eyes, the uneven halves of the face, that stretched smile. It was like the wall had a secret hidden inside it. I tried showing it to people. I remember calling someone into my room and pointing at the wall. I would say, "Look, that is Mr. Face." Most of the time, they could not see it. They would look at the wall for a few seconds, then look back at me with that expression adults get when they think a kid is being imaginative. They might say it was just paint. They might say it was a shadow. They might say it looked like nothing at all. That always frustrated me. To me, it was obvious. I could see the face clearly. I could see where the eyes were. I could see the smile. I could see the two different sides, the way one looked almost smooth and mask-like while the other looked more stretched and wrong. But nobody else saw it the way I did. Sometimes I would try harder to explain. I would describe the face. I would point to the exact parts. I would tell people to stand where I was standing, or lie on my bed, or turn their heads slightly. But even then, most people just saw a blue wall. Eventually, I stopped trying so hard. It became one of those things that I knew other people would not understand. I still talk to Mr. Face, though. I talked to it when I was bored. I talked to it when I was upset. I talked to it when I was supposed to be going to sleep, but was not tired yet. Sometimes I imagined it was listening quietly. Sometimes I imagined it was amused by the things I said because of that huge smile. Other times, I thought it looked sad. That depended on the lighting. A shadow could change the shape of the face enough that the smile looked less like a smile and more like something strained or tired. There were moments when I would wake up in the night and see it more clearly than usual. Those were the times that made me nervous. My room would be dark except for a little light from outside. Maybe a car had passed. Maybe moonlight was coming through the curtains. Maybe the hallway light had been left on. I would turn my head toward the wall, and there it would be. Miss Face, still there. Still smiling. The strange thing was that I never remember it moving. It did not blink. It did not talk back. It did not suddenly appear in a different part of the room. It never came off the wall. It was always just a face-shaped pattern that became visible at certain angles. And yet, it felt like more than that when I was a child. That is what makes it difficult to explain now. As I got older, I slowly stopped playing with it. I did not make a clear decision one day to stop talking to Mr. Face. It just happened naturally. I got older, started paying attention to different things, had more schoolwork, more friends, more hobbies, more things on my mind. The face became less important. I still saw it sometimes. I still knew it was there. But I did not spend hours looking at it anymore. I did not talk to it every day. I did not make up games with it. I think part of me started feeling embarrassed about it too. When you get older, you start realizing that other people might think something is weird, even if it feels normal to you. Talking to a creepy face on your wall is not exactly something you mention casually to friends, so I kept it to myself. But I never completely forgot about Mr. Face. Even now, I can picture it. The baby blue wall, the shape that blends into the paint. The uneven face. The huge stretched out smile. The fact that you have to see it from the right angle for it to appear. There is something about the way it blends in that still bothers me. It is not like a poster or a stain where you can point directly at it and say, "There it is." It only shows itself when the light and angle are right. That makes it feel like it is hiding, like it does not want to be noticed by everyone. At some point, I moved my bed. Now my bed is placed in front of the spot where Mr. Face used to be. Because of that, I do not really see it anymore. The wall is partly covered, and I do not lie in the same position I used to when I was younger. I do not stare at that side of the room the way I did as a kid. I do not have the same view of the wall. For a while, I did not think much about it. Then I started wondering whether Mr. Face was still there. The thought comes back to me every now and then. I will be lying in bed or cleaning my room, and I will remember that the wall behind my bed is the same wall where I used to see that face. I will think about the way it used to appear in the baby blue paint. I will remember talking to it when I was little. And then I wonder whether moving the bed is the only reason I cannot see it anymore. Maybe it is still there. Maybe nothing has changed. Maybe if I moved the bed back to where it used to be and looked from the same angle, I would see that stretched smile again. Part of me wants to check. During the summer, I am planning to move the bed back. Not because I want something scary to happen. Not because I am trying to prove that my room is haunted. I just want to know. I want to see whether Mr. Face is still on the wall after all these years. I want to know whether it was always some weird pattern in the paint that only my younger brain turned into a face. Maybe there is a crack, a patch of uneven paint, or a shape in the wall texture that happened to look different depending on the angle. That would make sense. Walls can do strange things in low light. Paint can dry unevenly. Shadows can create shapes. A mark that looks like nothing from one part of the room can become a face when you look at it from another. Maybe Mr. Face was never anything more than that. Maybe I was a little kid with a big imagination, and I found a pattern in my wall that became a friend because I needed something familiar at night. But there is another part of me that does not want the logical explanation. That is the strange thing. Mr. Face was creepy, but it was also comforting. It is still comforting in a weird way. When I think about it now, I do not only remember being afraid. I remember the feeling of having someone there when I was alone in my room. I remember talking to the wall and feeling like I was being listened to. I remember that wide smile looking strange but familiar. Maybe that is why I want to check. Not because I want to prove I saw a ghost. Maybe I just want to see an old childhood friend again. A very creepy childhood friend. There is a part of me that worries about what will happen when I move the bed. What if I do not see anything? That would probably be the normal outcome. I might move everything, stand where I used to stand, turn the lights off, wait for the right angle, and see nothing except a blue wall. Maybe the paint changed over the years. Maybe I only saw the face because my eyes were looking for it. Maybe childhood memory made it seem clearer than it ever really was. But what if I do see it again? What if I move the bed, look at the wall, and Mr. Face is still there, exactly as I remember it? The two uneven halves, the eyes, the stretched out smile, the same face that was beside my bed from the time I was 3 years old until I was old enough to stop talking to it. I do not know how I would feel. I think I would be scared. But I also think I would feel relieved. Because no matter how strange it sounds, Mr. Face was part of my childhood. It was there through years of sleeping in that room, being afraid of the dark, being sick, being sad, being bored, and imagining things only little kids understand. It was unsettling. It was creepy. It looked wrong. But it was familiar. And sometimes the strangest things are the ones that become comforting simply because they have been with you for so long.